Hello, I'm Cheryl McCarthy. Welcome to One to One. With the presidential election fast approaching, both sides agree that voter turnout will play a crucial role in who wins. Many Democrats are worried about what they view as increasing attempts by Republicans to suppress the vote, especially among liberals, people of color, immigrants, and residents of blue states and blue voting districts. What efforts are afoot to deprive citizens of their right to vote? And what can be done to counter their effects? Frank Deal, a professor at the CUNY School of Law, is an expert on the subject. As an attorney, he has worked on numerous voting rights cases, including during his 14 years at the Center for Constitutional Rights, and he teaches a course on voting rights at the law school. Welcome.
Hello, Cheryl.
So, everybody seems to be talking about their fears of voter suppression these days. Is voter suppression more of a crisis now than it was back in 2016?
I think it is. Voter suppression has a long history in this country, going even shortly after the 15th Amendment was ratified. You still had voter suppression taking place. So there's a long history of voter suppression in this country, but I think that the concerns about it today are much more exacerbated because of, for example, the fact that the current president, it seems to think it's up to him whether to leave office or not. And, concerns like that, I think, escalate the tension that this election is actually facing. And I think, therefore, there's much more emphasis on the voter suppression which is taking place.
So, what do we mean when we talk about voter suppression? Are we talking about intentional suppression? Are we talking about incompetence or both?
Well, I mean, that's kind of what the courts are always trying to figure out. That's not always so easy to do because people are not going to come out and say outright that they are, in fact, trying to suppress the vote. There are other kinds of excuses which are used to basically justify that same result. My own personal feeling is that there's a mixture of incompetence and intentional desire to suppress. I'm more inclined to think that, depending on who we're talking about, there's a lot of purposeful desire to suppress the vote for this coming election.
Has that become more prevalent since the Supreme Court's decision in 2013 in Shelby versus Holder?
Yes, it's become more prevalent, and actually it's become somewhat more obvious. If you sort of look at the data and the use of means to suppress voting, and one of the most popular means today is to essentially require some form of photo ID, that really picked up once the Supreme Court of the United States essentially relinquished numerous state governments from having to essentially pre-clear their voting changes with the Department of Justice. That's what the Shelby County case was about, in the sense that the court said that that requirement was unconstitutional as imposed on certain states in the country. And not having to go through that reporting requirement before putting changes into place, the legislatures could just do it by voting these things into place. And that's essentially what's happened in the very, very same states that had been required to get these pre-clearances before they actually could put these changes in place.
So who's behind the voter suppression efforts? Is it primarily a Republican thing? Do Democrats do it as well? Who's behind these voter suppression efforts?
My sense is that the most vigorous suppression efforts take place when you in fact have a general election where the parties are in competition with each other. And under those circumstances, my position is that 9 times out of 10, it is the Republicans who are engaged in voter suppression, which is not to say Democrats haven't done it. Like, for example, looking at a different form of voter suppression, there have been situations where Democratic legislatures, just like Republican legislatures, draw their districts in such a way as to protect the Democratic vote. I mean, that's a form
the gerrymandering.
Yes, right. That's a form of voter suppression too, and both parties, in fact, do that, right? But what we're seeing now is something I think very, very different, which is essentially doing research to find out the type of mechanisms which are most likely to prevent certain categories of the population from voting, and then choosing to put those mechanisms in place for that very purpose, right? North Carolina essentially did that. They researched, whether or not removing polling stations were going to affect the African-American community more than the white community. And they got an answer to that, which was going to affect the African-American community, and they just went on and did it after that. So some of the stuff, as I said, is actually blatant and outright. And it's happening because, as I was suggesting before, because the Supreme Court lifted that protective mechanism, which was designed to prevent these legislatures from going full steam without getting the approval of the Attorney General of the United States.
So who are the targets of voter suppression? Potential Black voters, immigrant voters, Democratic voters? Who are the targets?
Well, it's certainly Democratic voters. And the reality is that the African-American population votes more heavily Democratic than any other population in this country. So it's a consequence, right? You're targeting Democratic voters, you're targeting African-Americans. The allegations are that people are voting who are not entitled to vote. That's the so-called immigration question. And I don't think there's much of that taking place at all. So, you have this propaganda, this lingo about, people casting unauthorized ballots and, things along those lines. But the reality is that this that we're seeing today is an effort by the Republicans to suppress the Democratic vote. And because most African Americans vote Democratic, it's turning into an outright suppression of the African American vote.
So what kinds of voter suppression measures have the states and maybe the federal government also enacted since the Shelby decision?
Well, the one that I am seeing utilized the heaviest is the voter ID, a requirement that voters essentially, when they show up at the voting booth, that they have a form of ID with a picture on it, which is issued by the government, either the state government or the federal government. I mean, there have been requirements like that before the Shelby decision had essentially taken place. But if a state wanted to do that, right, the state had to show that that was not going to have a disproportionate effect on voters of color. And if states could do that, then it would get pre-cleared. What we're seeing after Shelby is states that have not gotten that pre-clearance putting that requirement in place in circumstances where it is going to have a disproportionate effect on voters of color. The best form of ID, photo ID, is a driver's license, for example. But what we were starting to see is in some of these southern localities, they were shutting down Department of Motor Vehicle offices. So it was harder to go into the office to get the driver's license and the photo ID. Now, recently in the Georgia gubernatorial election, we saw lines of people waiting for hours and hours just to get into the voting booth to cast their vote. And a couple of things happened. One, the voting machines went down, right? I think it was an electrical problem which took place. But the other problem was that they had removed some of the voting machines so that there were not anywhere near as many voting machines as there had been in previous elections. The fewer machines you have, the longer the lines are going to be when people show up to, in fact, vote. And it's discouraging to have to wait in line for hours and hours to do that. I have tremendous respect for the people who've done that, but everybody doesn't really want to do that. So, we see those kinds of things. And then the most incredible thing to me is just this whole attack on the post office, right? I mean, people know that with this pandemic taking place, people have been directed to essentially stay at home. I mean, now that some of those rules are lifting, people are slowly going out, but they still, try to avoid crowds and lines and things like that. So what do we see? A desire to vote absentee ballot, but it's an attack on the post office, right? So you see these pictures on social media of trucks carrying away mailboxes. We see pictures where people have actually seen the mail sorting machines destroyed, taken apart, and trashed, right? This is happening all over the country, and we only know of what we're catching on social media. If there's nobody,
what's been the rationale of the federal government for carrying away mailboxes?
There's been a drive for the longest period of time, and I think it's been somewhat bipartisan, right, to privatize the post office, to get more competition in terms of the post office. That was a serious mistake because I don't think the Democrats could foresee this situation that we're in now. But, when the legislation was put into place, which was to kind of designed to gear this privatization up, it was bipartisan. What's being said is that these are means to, believe it or not, streamline the Postal Service, make it operate more efficiently so that it is in fact running like a business, something like, some of the private companies which in fact haul mail and packages. But it's just happening at a terrible time. And I think because of the surrounding circumstances, one has to question the motivation of these moves happening at this moment.
So how effective have these measures been in denying qualified citizens the right to vote? And which of the measures do you think have had the biggest impact on denying citizens their right to vote?
If you look at Wisconsin, which recently had a set of elections under the context of the pandemic, and there was an intense litigation which was taking place before the vote in terms of whether voters could use the absentee ballots. And the result was that the Supreme Court said that they could not use universal absentee ballots. So the question was, who's going to go to the voting booths to essentially participate under these difficult circumstances? But sure enough, people did turn out. And I think that the result really surprised those who were behind the idea of not allowing for the use of absentee ballots. In other words, there wasn't a significant effect on who won the election. The people who the plans were designed to suppress turned out anyway, and it turns out that
it didn't work.
That's right, it didn't work. But on the other hand, if you look at the election in Georgia with Stacey Abrams, I have no doubt that removing those ballot boxes and on those polling stations and having so many of those machines inoperative on the actual day of the election cost her the election, right? So, it kind of depends on where you happen to be. It depends on the specificness in which the voters, take the election process. It depends on how extreme the mechanisms are that are utilized by the state. And I think the Stacey Abrams election is one that we should all be very concerned about, because the pictures were going all over the world of how long people had to wait in order to vote in that election.
All of this sounds so sleazy. It sounds like what dictators in non-democratic countries like Russia, Syria, China, North Korea do in order to remain in power for years and years. And yet it's happening in the United States. And there seems to be a resurgence of it in the United States. But as you pointed out, there has been voter suppression in the United States a long time before now, and even before Jim Crow, correct?
That's right. That's right. In fact, in my voting rights class, we look at a case that was decided by the Supreme Court in 1905, a case called Giles v. Alabama. This is a case that was before the court, almost 35 years after the ratification of the 15th Amendment. The 15th Amendment, of course, prohibited states from discriminating in regards to the right to vote on the basis of race and color. Well, Mr. Giles went to his voting station in Alabama and was told outright, we are not registering African-American voters. That's what he was told. And he had, the audacity and the resources to go to court to challenge this. The case went to the Supreme Court of the United States, and none other than the infamous Oliver Wendell Holmes wrote an opinion saying, essentially, there is nothing we can do about this. If the people of Alabama do not want African-American voters to participate in the voting process, that is a problem they have to deal with in the political process in the state of Alabama. That's what they were told. And as I said, this is years, decades after the ratification of the 15th Amendment.
You're referring to the voting rights course that you teach at the CUNY Law School. What are some of the kinds of things that they learn in your class that they may not have known about the whole voting system that they might not have known before?
Well, we have a pretty savvy group of students, and I, like to think that many, if not most of them, have some direct engagement in the political process and have for some time. In fact, I have a person in my class who's a politician himself. But in any event, we go into things that you sort of read about in the newspapers, and we get into them in much greater depth. So, for example, another means of voter suppression is disenfranchising people who've committed crimes, right? The state of Florida, for example, just passed a referendum where surprising to me, considering that the state of Florida was the state where the whole Bush v. Gore thing exploded in the year 2000, but the voters essentially voted by an overwhelming margin to essentially allow for people, most people who have committed crimes except for the hyper serious crimes, to in fact be allowed to vote, notwithstanding those convictions. And immediately there was litigation about this. And what the litigation turned on was whether or not the state of Florida could impose, on top of this referendum effect, a requirement that those people who now have the right to vote pay off all kinds of fines and restitutions and fees and all these other kinds of things before they can in fact exercise the right to vote. So that question has been in the courts for about a year now. And we'll just see how it all plays out. But it's sort of stunning that, as I said, the people of Florida, voted in a direct form of direct democracy to in fact re-enfranchise people who were convicted of crime. And the state legislature immediately intervened by passing a law saying that now that's not okay. You have to pay all these fines beforehand, knowing that those folks are not going to have that kind of money to pay those fines. So we kind of get into that in some detail. We look at this history that I've been making allusions to. We're going to talk a lot. So much just started, by the way. We're going to talk a lot about the whole issue with Shelby County and the history of the Voting Rights Act and why it was such a brilliant idea for Congress in 1965 to put in place that pre-clearance mechanism. And then we'll spend some time talking about the terrible effects of the declaring of those provisions unconstitutional, as well as look at some of the legislation which Congress has put in place, which is sitting on Mitch McConnell's desk as we speak, right? The John Lewis Voting Rights Act, which was designed to basically restore some of the rights that Shelby County took away. So we get into all that stuff. We also talk about money, right? The role of these huge financial conglomerates, which make running for office so expensive and do so much to put political candidates at the behest of those who have the greatest amount of dollars to contribute to a particular campaign. We try to get into all of those issues.
So what can be done, and perhaps what is being done, to push back against these voter suppression efforts? And are any of these things being successful?
For better or worse, the front line has been litigation. Thankfully, we have a number of organizations throughout the country who do voting rights litigation with people who are very skilled in this very elaborate aspect of law. And, they can, get to court fairly quickly when, in fact, there is something taking place in the electoral system which suggested it's put in place for the purposes of discouraging participation in the voting system. I mean, Shelby County took away an extremely helpful mechanism for resolving these matters in the court, but, private litigants can still go into court to challenge state and governmental activities which have the effect of suppressing voting rights. So, there are, litigators and organizations all over the country doing this work, and they can do it very, very quickly. Now, the consequences, can you get the results that you need? And that's, with Trump filling so many of these seats in the federal judiciary, especially on the courts of appeals, it's obviously getting harder to essentially win those cases, but those cases are being filed. I think that the tremendous numbers of people that we've seen on the streets since the death of George Floyd, something that I think goes beyond anything that I've seen in this country's history. If we can get those people to vote, it would make a tremendous difference. And I'm just hoping that as part of the organizing effort that went into that, there is attention focused on the importance of essentially participating in the political process, although I'm sure a lot of those people would have a lot of skepticism about the process because of the way they see it as being dominated by big financial interests. So, I think that that's, and just the general education stuff, as I said, first of all, the so-called mainstream media has to sort of, call out these things that are taking place, and they have to pick up on the tremendous amount of information we're getting from individuals, solitary individuals scattered all over the country with cell phones who are like filming, as I said, filming these trucks that are taking away mailboxes and filming these mail sorting machines sitting behind post offices all over the country, literally dismantled and thrown into the garbage, right? I mean, people take those pictures hit social media, and then the mainstream media picks up on it, and then we start to get some sort of reaction to it. Those congressional hearings to look at what this guy was doing with the United States Postal Service, they didn't really get underway until people saw those social media images of those mailboxes being carted away all over the country.
And all of this underlines the importance of people getting out there, turning out on election day. What message do you want to leave our viewers with?
Well, of course, the first message, I'm not sure this audience needs to hear this, but it's to not only vote yourself, but to tell all of your surrounding loved ones this election is one of the most important elections that this country has ever faced. And I think that the turnout has to be so large that there is no doubt in anybody's mind who won. Because any doubt is going to be seized upon, right, by this person who's the president of the United States as some justification for his not leaving. And the reality is that there are going to be a lot of mail-in ballots. You know, we're not going to know who actually won this election until just some days afterwards. So this is a very precarious situation that we are walking into. And I think we need to all be attuned to it, and we all need to participate in the process. And if things really start to getting very shaky, we all need to hit the streets.
Okay. Thank you so much, Professor Deal. I'm afraid we're out of time. But thank you for joining me today. And for the City University of New York and One to One, I'm Cheryl McCarthy.